Good morning. Once again, it is good to see each of you here. And what a beautiful morning, as Paul pointed out, it truly is. And how blessed we are to be able to gather together to worship God, especially on such a wonderful day that we have been given. As you guys know, we've been going over a series of lessons through the book of Romans. And as we've been going through those lessons and as we've been examining those things, we've learned a great deal about the book of Romans and the expectation that Paul had for the congregation that was there. And when we think of Paul and as he wrote that book or that letter to Rome, to the church therein, he did so with one goal in mind, and that was to unify that which was divided. You had there, as we remember and reflect upon, Paul dealing with doctrinal matters, and then in the latter half, chapter 12 and following, with practical lessons on this idea of unity. The idea of unifying those who were born Jews but had obeyed the gospel with those who were born Gentiles and had obeyed the gospel. And we find ourselves in Romans chapter 15, and we'll be looking specifically at verses 14 through 33, where Paul is going to be examining the idea and looking at this idea of personal notes to the brethren. He's going to be talking about and looking at. He's going to be teaching them some things of his personal ministry, his personal preaching, that we can learn from and we can examine. If you have your handout, let's go ahead and look at our text today. And let's look at our first point, and that is preaching practices. When we look at what Paul had examined, we look at what was done there, we see that there was a great expectation. We see that Paul, in writing in Romans chapter 15, starting in verse 14, he delivers what is a practice in preaching that is of utmost importance. When we think about preaching, we realize that the Scriptures are full of expectations or responsibilities that the preacher and his sermons ought to have. We realize, for example, that in Jude 3, they are to contend earnestly for the faith. Sermons are expected to have a certain understanding, a certain relationship or expectation of them, that they are to contend or to fight for truth and righteousness. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2, I'm reminded of what Paul wrote to Timothy there when he said, of course, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. We see the Scriptures in there telling Timothy, a preacher, that his sermons need to reprove, they need to rebuke, and they need to exhort. Those first two are oftentimes ones that preachers, if they're not careful, will end up holding on to too closely, reproving and rebuking. And don't get me wrong, 2 out of 3 is in the negative sense, and sermons must recognize sin, and when sin is prevalent or when it's understood, it needs to be talked about, looked at, and discussed from the Scripture. However, when we start looking back at this idea of what the expectations are of preachers, we see Paul in here, after dealing with such difficult realities to the church at Rome. Paul, having dealt with division, having spent so much time, in fact, 10 chapters, chapter 2 through chapter 11, dealing with division that had been rising, especially with the Jewish children of God. And having dealt with all that, then he gets in those practical lessons as we've looked at, and he's still having to try to bring them together. And so with all this, we see after dealing with that and after looking at that, after that reproof and that rebuke, if you will, we see in Romans chapter 15 and in verse 14 it says this, I myself am satisfied about you, my brothers, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able to instruct one another. When we think about this and look at this, Paul holds up what he told Timothy, didn't he? after needing to get onto them, and it was needed, don't get me wrong, there was definitely issues that were going on with the church in Rome. But then having dealt with all that, Paul then says, I myself am satisfied about you. You yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able to instruct one another. Every single one of us, and as we've been looking at this, we've been talking about the Jews, they brought in baggage, didn't they? The Gentiles did to some degree, but the Jews were most prolific in this area. They had brought in a lot of baggage with them. A lot of theology that was no longer prevalent under the law of Christ, such as the areas of circumcision, such as the areas of Jewish superiority over everyone else, or at least that was the mentality and the thought. And so, having brought in that baggage, we realize that everyone has baggage to some degree, don't they? Everyone has those things that they are affected with, that they are dealing with it. And preachers especially have practices that their sermons start to develop that we see this. And here is where we see this need, if you will, and what we're going to be focusing on really in these 3 points is this idea of the preacher and the congregation and how they work together, because that's really what Paul is getting at in these. He's explaining to them the relationship they need between him and them. Him, a preacher, a gospel preacher for the Lord, them, the congregation whom he is desiring so desperately to go and serve. And in this we see that Paul is making sure that we understand that there is a necessity, no matter what is going on, no matter how much reproving and rebuking is needing, there is a necessity of exhortation. And as I mentioned, preachers can bring in baggage with them as well. You guys know when I first came, I was pretty fired up. In the situation that I left, the congregation I left, there was so much discord and so many issues going on. I had so much built up within me. We talked about anger this morning. I had a lot of anger. Anger at the faithful there that weren't standing up for the truth. Anger at the unfaithful who were trying to destroy the church, and anger at myself for having been young and stupid and not knowing how to understand it and help it. And seeing the damage that it was causing. And I remember that as I look back on my sermons, I remember they were pretty fiery. They were not so much a reflection of the congregation, but a reflection of what I had been through. And I'm reminded last year, in January of 2016, of a beautiful moment that took place. There towards the end of the month, I remember some wonderful brethren who are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able to instruct one another very well, pulled me aside from this congregation, Paul and Mark. And they said, brother, we love you. We love the sermons that you're presenting. We appreciate the work you put in. We're excited for the fact that you love to preach the truth and you want us to get to heaven, but I'll never forget what was said in that meeting. They said, but sometimes the way you preach, because it's so hard, and because there's not really enough encouragement in it, we feel like it's hard to get to heaven. If not, sometimes feel it impossible. And I remember being so thankful. So thankful that they took me aside and said, listen, those things are good. We need those things, but we also need this. Don't forget the third part. Paul, in doing all he had done, he said, listen, even though you have these issues, you're a good congregation, a wonderful congregation. I started from that point doing a series of lessons that lasted, if I remember right, about 6 months on the blessings of Christianity. When we think about the relationship that Paul is showing here, Paul is saying, listen, there has to be that balance, I think. Paul's showing them that he trusts them even though they had some challenges and difficulties. Everybody has those things in which they go through. Everybody has those things that are challenging in their life. But Paul said we have to also preach the good. I'm reminded what he told the brethren in Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 1, 16 through 19. I do not cease to give thanks to you, remembering you in my prayers, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation and the knowledge of him. Notice this. Having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which he has called you. What are the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints? And what is the immeasurable greatness of his power towards us who believe, according to the work of his great might? Brothers and sisters, what a beautiful relationship it is when preachers in a congregation have the right understanding. They have the right relationship, and they're able to go to each other and say, listen, this is what we need. A preacher ought to be trying his very best to understand what a congregation needs, and the congregation needs to let the preacher know. What a beautiful example of this is seen. And so when we look at this, we see that there is an important part of preaching, isn't there? There's an important part of sermons, delivery, and expectations that are with them. Yes, we must contend earnestly for the faith of all preachers, but we must also not only reprove and rebuke, but exhort to build up. And what a wonderful thing it is, and I'm so thankful to be a part of a congregation who loves to be exhorted and appreciates when necessary the reproving and rebuking. But as we continue on through Romans chapter 15, we see Paul also deals with another area of preaching, if you will, and that is the idea of priorities. When we look at this, we see that Paul was having to deal with some things that were that he had to prioritize in his life. You see, he wanted to go and see those in Rome. Remember, he starts chapter 1 saying that. Here in chapter 15, he's saying it again. Listen, I have a desire to be with you. It's not that I don't want to come and be with you. I want to be there. But he explains why he hasn't been able to. And in Romans chapter 15 and 16, he gives the reason here. He says, and on some points I have written to you very boldly by way of reminder, because of the grace given to me by God, to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles in the priestly service of the gospel of God, so that the offering of the Gentiles may be acceptable, sanctified by the Spirit. He goes on to say, listen, I had to go all over the place. In fact, I'm trying to fulfill the scripture. Says, those who have not heard, I have sent someone to teach. Paul said, listen, I've gone to those areas where they have not heard the gospel, and I have preached the gospel. In fact, he said, because I went out to the Gentiles, and because I've gone out to the places where their gospel has not been taught, it has kept me. Notice what he says there in 22. It is for this reason why I've so often been hindered from coming to you. You see, what happens more often than not is preachers must create priorities. And what happens is the great responsibility is everybody has, like any work that is done, we have responsibilities, don't we? We have those things that must be done, but there has to be a balance in that, and there has to be a check mark, if you will, a reminder. Just like with the sermons, it must be with the preaching as well, the preacher as well. Preachers must understand that when they have priorities and they set those priorities, they can't forget the ones that come in at the bottom. It's not necessarily because those things are not important. Paul was putting a great importance on seeing Rome. It's just because other things were of need at that time. And what oftentimes happens, and what shouldn't happen, but what oftentimes happens is those things that were there that have not been gotten to, they get forgotten. And Paul says, I want you as a congregation to know I haven't forgotten you. There's been some things that have hindered me. Some priorities had to be made, but I haven't forgotten you. It's almost, and you can kind of imagine, if you will, Rome saying, hey, Paul, when are you going to come? We know you want to. We've heard about you wanting to come. We can't wait to see you. When we think of the preacher and the congregation relationship, we think of the great necessity that is in this area as well. Sometimes as preachers we can get so caught up in doing those things that we put a high priority on, we can either forget about the other priorities or place them at a spot that they ought not be. Like Paul, I want to encourage the congregation to be reminded that you have a responsibility to help me in that. But I don't want to forget anyone. I don't want to lose out on anything or forget any priority. Yes, there are times where things I might want to get done, other things have to be done first. But that doesn't mean that it's at the expense of the other ones. Like Paul, I want to encourage you to understand the reasons maybe I've been hindered, but I ask for your help in making sure that I grow and I become strengthened with you. Paul encapsulates all of this in his third point to them. He encapsulates this whole idea and this whole thought really in this third part when he talks about the prayers. And in Romans chapter 15 and verse 30, he beseeches the brethren, he asks the brethren to pray on his behalf. He asks the brethren to come to him, to pray for him, that he may not only be strengthened in what he's about to do, verse 31, which is go into the mouth of the lion where he had been so popular as a Pharisee most likely and had caused so much division, and now he was on the other side, that those in Judea might not hinder him in his work, but that the church may be uplifted in Jerusalem because of him. Brothers and sisters, when we think about the reality here, we need prayers. Paul oftentimes sought prayers from the congregations he was a part of. From the church at Colossae, he asked for prayers that the doors would be opened, didn't he? And that he would have the right words to say. When we think of the church at Ephesus, he prayed or asked for prayers that he would be strengthened in his work, that he would have the right words to say. We think over and over, if the Apostle Paul needed the prayers of the brethren, so do all preachers today. All preachers need the prayers of the congregation in which they help to serve. Brothers and sisters, when we think about the reality, and we think about these personal notes that Paul wrote to the brethren there, we are reminded of the relationship he was wanting. The relationship he was desiring to have with his congregation. I have told many a person, and I've mentioned it to you, but I can't say it enough, how blessed I am to be a part of a congregation that loves the Lord. To be a part of a congregation that desires righteousness over all else, desires faithfulness. I thank you for making my job as a preacher for the Lord, for making it a pleasure to be a part of. I know a great many preachers, and that's not the case everywhere. This congregation is to be commended. This congregation is to be uplifted. And I pray that all will look to this congregation as a guide for what the church ought to be, as the example it is in the brotherhood. And may we always strive to be what God wants us to be. It might be the case this morning that there's someone here reflecting upon the things in which we have looked at, reflecting upon the things in which we've done. Maybe you've been dealing with sin in your life. Maybe you haven't been living up to the expectations of God. We all feel that way, and then sometimes it is the case that we end up that way. If it is the case and you find yourself having lacking, let the congregation here help you. Let the congregation be for you what Christ intended it to be, and that is your family who is here to strengthen you, help you, and encourage you. I pray that you will take hold of the gift that this congregation is, if you are in need of that. Maybe it is the case this morning someone else or someone here is needing the prayers of this congregation because of a difficulty they're going through, a challenge. We always want to make sure that it is understood that we love you, and that we are here for you as well. And that, as the Lord said, we weep with those who weep, and we rejoice with those who rejoice. If there's someone here who's weeping, let us weep with you, and let us be there for you. Let us help you. Don't push us away, but rather grow closer to us in your time of need. Maybe there's someone here who is in need of the prayers of this congregation. And if that is the case, let us know as we come together now, we stand and we sing.